"I'll be your wife if you let me sleep here," the runaway bride said to the mountain man. She knocked on his cabin door with a blizzard at her back, and a past she didn't dare speak of. He hadn't asked for company, but one look at her shaking hands and broken boots, and something in him shifted. They say she was just looking for shelter, but something's not right. Now there's smoke on the ridge, tracks in the snow, and what started as mercy might turn into something far more dangerous. Who is she really? And what storm did she bring with her? Your comments remind me that we're not alone in feeling deeply. If loyalty, second chances, and human dignity mean something to you, then you're right where you belong. The bitter wind howled through the Bitterroot Range as Boone McAllister stoked his cabin's hearth. His weathered hands moved with practiced ease, feeding kindling to the hungry flames. The familiar crackle of burning pine couldn't quite drown out the emptiness that had been his only companion these past years. A knock at the door startled him. Out here, visitors were as rare as spring flowers in November. The pounding came again, weaker this time. Boone's hand instinctively moved to the rifle propped by his chair, but something in the desperate sound made him pause. He crossed the rough-hewn floorboards in 3 long strides and pulled open the heavy door. The sight before him stole his breath quicker than the blast of cold air. A young woman swayed on his doorstep, her wedding dress caked with mud and snow. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins, whipping wild in the wind. Her eyes, glassy with cold and exhaustion, struggled to focus on his face. "I'll be your wife," she whispered through blue-tinged lips, "if you let me sleep here." Boone caught her as she collapsed, her slight frame no match for his strong arms. Without a word, he carried her inside, kicking the door shut behind them. The girl's skin felt like ice through the sodden fabric of her dress. Her boots, clearly not made for mountain travel, were split at the seams and crusted with frost. He laid her near the hearth, where the fire's warmth could reach her best. Reaching for the wool blanket draped across his chair, the one his wife had woven years ago, he wrapped it around the shivering woman. The familiar pattern of the weave brought a familiar ache to his chest, but he pushed the feeling aside. There were more pressing matters at hand. Boone moved with quiet efficiency, heating beef broth over the fire and gathering extra blankets. The storm outside was picking up, snow falling thick and fast now. He'd seen enough winters in these mountains to know this was just the beginning. The young woman drifted in and out of consciousness as he spooned warm broth between her lips. Her skin gradually warmed, though her cheeks remained pale as morning frost. Boone watched her with careful eyes, noting how even in sleep, her brow remained furrowed with worry. Hours passed before she truly woke. Boone had moved her to his spare cot, and she struggled to sit up, wincing at what must have been sore muscles from her journey. "Where?" she started, her voice rough. "You're safe," Boone said simply, offering her a tin cup of water. "Name's Boone McAllister." She took the cup with trembling hands. "Clara Beth Whitley," she answered, though her eyes wouldn't quite meet his. "That's quite a dress for mountain climbing," Boone observed, keeping his tone neutral. Clara's fingers tightened around the cup. "I had my reasons." "Most folks do." Boone stood, his joints protesting the movement. "But come daylight, you ride back down. Whatever you're running from, it ain't my business." A gust of wind rattled the cabin's windows, and they both turned to look. The snow was falling harder now, thick white curtains obscuring the world beyond the glass. Clara's face paled further, if that was possible, but she said nothing. Boone moved to add another log to the fire, his movements deliberate and practiced. The familiar task helped him push away memories of another snowy night, years ago, when he'd lost everything that mattered. He didn't need any more complications in his life, especially not in the form of a runaway bride with secrets in her eyes. The wind continued to howl outside, promising the kind of storm that could bury a cabin for days. Boone knew the smart thing would be to send her on her way at first light, before whatever trouble she was fleeing caught up with her. But something in the way she held herself, proud even in her desperation, reminded him of another woman who'd once sought shelter in these mountains. He kept his back to Clara as he tended the fire, giving them both the privacy of silence. The flames cast dancing shadows on the cabin walls, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf called out to the storm-dark sky. Tomorrow would bring what it brought, but for now, they were just two souls waiting out the night, while winter tightened its grip on the Bitterroot Range. Dawn crept over the Bitterroot Range, painting the world in shades of white. The storm had worked through the night, leaving behind a pristine blanket of snow that stretched as far as the eye could see. Boone stood at his cabin window, steam rising from the coffee cup in his weathered hands. The familiar view had transformed overnight. Every tree branch, every fence post wore a thick coat of white. He pulled on his heavy coat and stepped outside, boots crunching in snow that reached halfway up his shins. The morning air bit at his face as he made his way to the woodpile. The axe felt right in his hands, its familiar weight grounding him as he set to work. Each swing sent chips of wood flying, the sharp crack echoing across the silent landscape. After an hour of chopping, Boone paused to survey the mountain trail that led down to the valley. What had been a clear path yesterday was now buried under feet of snow, the markers barely visible. No one would be traveling that route for days, maybe weeks. He gathered an armload of split wood and headed back inside. Clara stood at his cast-iron stove, her borrowed dress hanging loose on her frame. She'd managed to find his small store of beans and salt pork, and the cabin filled with the homey smell of cooking. Her hands moved with the sure confidence of someone used to kitchen work, though she kept stealing nervous glances his way. "Much obliged," Boone said gruffly, setting the wood beside the hearth. "Trail's sealed tight. Reckon you'll be staying a spell, whether we like it or not?" Clara nodded, stirring the beans with careful attention. "I can earn my keep," she said softly. "I know my way around a kitchen and needle." They ate in silence as evening approached, the only sound the scrape of spoons against tin bowls. Finally, Boone set his empty bowl aside and fixed Clara with a stern look. "Time for truth," he said. "No more dancing around it. What brings a woman in a wedding dress up this mountain in November?" Clara's hands twisted in her lap. The firelight caught the shadows under her eyes, making them seem deeper. "I ran from a marriage I never agreed to," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "To Levi Tanton." Boone's expression didn't change, but his shoulders tensed at the name. "His father owns half the cattle in the territory," Clara continued. "The Whitleys, the missionary family that took me in after my mother died, they weren't kind folk. Treated me more like hired help than kin. When Levi started coming around, making his intentions known, they saw opportunity." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "I refused him. Said I wouldn't marry a man who looked at me like I was property to be claimed. That's when they declared me hysterical. Had me committed to a sanitarium in town." Boone's hands tightened on his chair arms, but he remained silent, letting her speak. "There was a nurse there, Mary, who saw what was happening. She helped me escape." Clara reached into the pocket of her borrowed dress and pulled out a folded paper, worn at the creases. "I only took 2 things when I fled, my mother's Bible and this deed to her land on the eastern ridge. It's all I have left of her." Boone's eyes fixed on the fire, its flames reflecting in his dark eyes. The mention of the eastern ridge land seemed to strike something deep within him, though his expression remained carefully neutral. "The land has water rights," Clara added quietly. "Good water, from what my mother always said. I think that's why Levi—" She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. The fire crackled in the silence that followed, throwing shadows against the cabin walls. Outside, the wind whispered through snow-laden branches, and somewhere in the distance, a lone wolf called out to the night. Boone continued to stare into the flames, as if reading something in their dance that only he could see. Clara watched him anxiously, waiting for some response to her story. But Boone remained still, his weathered face unreadable in the firelight, while the snow continued to fall softly outside, sealing them both away from the world below. Clara's breathing had grown steady, her form curled beneath the wool blanket near the hearth. The fire's glow softened her features, erasing the worry lines that had marked her face during their conversation. Boone watched her for a long moment, making sure she was truly asleep before moving to the corner of the cabin where an old cedar chest sat beneath his gun rack. The chest's hinges creaked softly as he opened it. Inside lay carefully preserved remnants of his previous life: beaded moccasins, a medicine bundle wrapped in tanned hide, and beneath these, a leather-bound ledger. His hands, rough from years of trapping and survival, handled the book with unexpected gentleness. Settling back in his chair, Boone opened the ledger. The pages were filled with careful notes in two distinct hands, his own angular script and the more flowing hand of his late wife. He turned the pages slowly until he found what he sought: a carefully drawn map of the eastern ridge. There, in his wife's precise writing, were the words "Sacred Spring." His finger traced the notation, remembering how she'd described the place, a source of pure water that had sustained her Nez Perce family for generations before the treaties pushed them north. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Levy Tanton's interest in Clara suddenly made terrible sense. The railroad survey crews had been through last spring, marking routes for the new line. Water rights would be worth more than gold once construction began. The Tantons weren't after Clara. They were after the spring that had once belonged to his wife's people. Boone closed the ledger with careful hands, his jaw tight. He'd heard rumors about Tanton's methods, how land seemed to fall into his hands through convenient marriages or mysterious accidents. The thought of such a man controlling the sacred spring stirred something in him that he'd thought long buried. Morning came with bitter cold. Clara was already up when Boone emerged from his small bedroom, trying to coax life from the banked coals. He watched her for a moment, noting how she'd arranged his meager kitchen supplies with quiet efficiency. "That deed you mentioned," he said, making her start slightly. "Mind if I take a look?" Clara hesitated only briefly before retrieving the paper from her borrowed dress. The document was creased and water-stained from her flight through the snow, but the writing remained clear. Boone studied it carefully, noting the official seal and signatures. It was proper and legal, a valid claim to land that held far more value than Clara likely knew. "You can stay," he said finally, handing the deed back. "At least through winter. Trail won't be passable for months anyway." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "But you should know, this mountain don't show mercy, but neither do men like Tanton." Clara's hands trembled slightly as she tucked the deed away, but her voice was steady. "I understand. I've seen his kind of mercy before." The days that followed fell into a pattern. Boone showed Clara the essential tasks of mountain survival: how to haul water from the creek without breaking through thin ice, the proper way to split kindling so it would catch quickly in the morning. She proved a quick study, her determination making up for lack of experience. "Keep your wrist loose," he instructed, demonstrating how to set a rabbit snare. "Animal won't trigger it if the wire's too tight." Clara nodded, her fingers mimicking his movements until she could tie the knot properly. They developed an uneasy rhythm. Clara took over the cooking and mending, while Boone handled the heavier work of chopping wood and checking his trap lines. They spoke little, but the silence became more comfortable as days passed. Sometimes, watching her work in the firelight, Boone caught glimpses of another woman's grace in Clara's movements, memories he'd thought safely buried, rising unbidden to the surface. Each evening, after Clara retired to her cot, Boone would take out the ledger again. He studied the map of the sacred spring, his wife's handwriting a painful reminder of all that had been lost. Now, with Clara's arrival, the past and present had become tangled in ways he never expected. The land that had slipped from his wife's people through broken treaties had somehow found its way back through this young woman's desperate flight. The knowledge weighed heavily on him. He'd promised his wife's family he would protect their heritage, but grief and guilt had driven him into isolation instead. Now, fate had delivered both a second chance and a heavy responsibility to his cabin door. The days grew shorter as November faded into December. Morning frost crept higher up the cabin windows each dawn, painting delicate patterns that Clara traced with her finger while waiting for the coffee to boil. The rhythm of mountain life settled into her bones, the crackle of the morning fire, the whisper of wind through pine boughs, the distant cry of eagles riding the updrafts. One morning, a steady drip of water onto the table during breakfast prompted Boone to climb onto the roof. Clara watched through the window as he worked, his movements sure despite the cold. His breath clouded in the winter air as he carefully replaced damaged shingles, patching holes with practiced hands. Inside, Clara had found purpose in her own tasks. She'd discovered a stack of empty flour sacks in the lean-to, the fabric sturdy despite its humble origins. With needle and thread salvaged from her wedding dress, she transformed the rough cloth into simple curtains. The cabin's windows had stood bare since Boone's wife passed, and something in his expression softened when he saw Clara hanging them. "Ayanna used to say a house needs curtains," he said quietly, surprising Clara with the voluntary mention of his wife. "Said they was like eyelids. Everyone needs to blink sometimes." That evening, as Clara stirred a pot of bean soup, Boone spoke again. "She was Nez Perce," he said, his voice rough with disuse. "Met her when I was scouting for the army. Never seen anyone handle a horse like she could." His weathered hands worked at cleaning his rifle as he talked, the familiar motion seeming to ease the words out. "Our boy Thomas, he had her way with animals too. Could gentle any creature he came across." Clara kept her movements slow and steady, afraid any sudden gesture might break this rare moment of openness. "What happened to them?" she asked softly. Boone's hands stilled on the rifle. "Bannock War took 'em both. Thomas was just 14. Army was pushing everyone onto reservations. Didn't matter if you'd been peaceful, didn't matter if you'd helped him before." He drew a deep breath. "Ayanna got caught in a skirmish. Thomas just disappeared. Never found him, never knew for certain." His voice trailed off, and Clara felt the weight of years of grief in the silence that followed. She understood now why he'd taken her in that snowy night. He knew too well what it meant to be caught between two worlds, to be pushed aside by those with power. That night, as Clara set the table for supper, Boone added a third plate to the setting. She paused, watching as he placed it with careful precision at the empty side of the table. His eyes met hers, and something in them made her chest tight. "Do it out of habit," he explained gruffly. "For them who are gone. Ayanna always said an empty chair at the table means there's room for hope to sit down." Clara nodded, understanding. She'd seen the missionary wives do something similar, setting places for loved ones far away. But this felt different, more like keeping a wound open to make sure you remembered it was real. The howl came just as they were finishing their meal, a long, mournful sound that made the hair on Clara's neck stand up. Boone was on his feet in an instant, rifle in hand. More howls answered the first, closer now. "Wolves," he said tersely, "getting bold with the deep snow." He moved to the window, checking the loading of his rifle with practiced movements. Clara rose and joined him, their breath fogging the glass as they peered into the darkness. The moon cast blue shadows on the snow, and in that ghostly light, dark shapes moved between the trees. Clara felt her heart quicken, but she stood her ground beside Boone. His shoulder brushed hers as he adjusted his stance, and she found the contact oddly comforting. "They won't come closer," he said after a while, though he kept his rifle ready. "Not with the fire going. But they're hungry. Winter's been hard already." Clara watched the shadows move through the trees, thinking about hunger and survival and the things that drove both beasts and men to desperate acts. She thought about Boone, setting that extra place at the table night after night, feeding a hunger of his own. They stood together at the window until the howls faded into the distance. Neither spoke, but something had shifted between them, a shared understanding born of darkness and memory, and the simple act of standing watch together. Sunday dawned clear and cold, the mountain air sharp enough to steal breath. Clara woke early, watching golden light creep across frost-rimed window panes. The cabin felt different on this day of rest, quieter somehow, as if the very walls knew their purpose. "We ought to keep the Sabbath," Clara said softly, as Boone stirred from his bedroll near the hearth. He grunted, reaching for the coffee pot with sleep-stiff hands. "Ain't been to proper church in years," he muttered, but there was no resistance in his tone. He moved through his morning routine, while Clara smoothed her skirts and retrieved a small leather-bound Bible from her few possessions. The coffee pot bubbled and steamed as Clara opened the worn pages. Morning light streamed through her new curtains, casting gentle shadows across the wooden table. She cleared her throat and began to read from Psalms, her voice steady and clear in the quiet cabin. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." Boone's movements slowed as he prepared the coffee, his attention caught by the familiar words. Clara's voice carried the verses with care, as if each one were precious. When she finished, silence settled around them like a warm blanket. "Been a while since I heard those words," Boone said, setting a tin cup of coffee before her. "Ayanna used to read sometimes, from a Bible the missionaries gave her." Clara wrapped her hands around the warm cup. The afternoon stretched before them, peaceful and unhurried. Outside, a jay called, its sharp voice carrying through the thin mountain air. "Can I tell you something?" Clara asked, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. When Boone nodded, she continued. "I never knew my real parents. The Whitleys told me my mother was Cherokee, but they kept no records. Said it wasn't important." She pulled the folded deed from her pocket, smoothing its creased surface. "This land deed, it's all I have of her, my only inheritance." Boone studied her face in the warm light, his eyes taking in features he'd seen but hadn't truly observed before. The high cheekbones, the proud set of her jaw, the wisdom in her dark eyes that seemed older than her years. He nodded slowly, with a respect that made Clara sit straighter. "A person's blood speaks through their face," he said quietly. "Seen it in my boy. Seen it in you too." As evening approached, Clara noticed pine boughs Boone had brought in earlier, meant for the fire. "We could make Christmas decorations," she suggested, gathering fallen pine cones from the pile. "String them with those red winter berries I saw by the creek." Something flickered in Boone's eyes, memory, perhaps, or longing. He watched as Clara found thread in her sewing kit and began to work. After a moment, he joined her, his large hands surprisingly nimble as they threaded berries and pine cones into simple garlands. "Thomas used to gather berries like these," he said, rolling one between his fingers. "Said they looked like tiny lanterns in the snow." Clara worked quietly, letting him speak at his own pace. When she reached for her bundle of belongings to store the leftover thread, she noticed a small wooden box among Boone's things. At her questioning glance, he nodded permission. Inside the box lay treasures of a life long past: a beaded bracelet, a carved wooden horse, and beneath them, a simple cedar cross. Clara lifted it carefully, its wood smooth with age and handling. "Ayanna made that," Boone said, his voice rough. "Said it reminded her that love speaks all languages." Clara held the cross gently, feeling its weight of memory and meaning. "May I hang it?" she asked. "Above the hearth?" Boone was silent for a long moment, then nodded. Clara stood, carefully placing the cross above the fireplace. It seemed to belong there, as if it had been waiting all along to return to its proper place. The firelight danced across the cedar, casting warm shadows on the wall. Their Christmas garlands hung in simple loops, pine cones and berries catching the light. Clara stepped back, standing beside Boone as they looked at their shared handiwork. "Looks like a proper home," he said quietly, and Clara heard all the things he wasn't saying, about loss and healing, about finding family in unexpected places, about the way hope could take root even in the coldest season. They stood together in the gentle quiet, watching the fire paint shadows on the cross above the hearth, while outside, the mountain night wrapped around their small cabin like a prayer. The December morning dawned crisp and bright, sunlight glinting off fresh snow outside the cabin windows. Clara stood at the wood stove, stirring a pot of morning porridge when the first wave of nausea hit her. She gripped the edge of the counter, willing the feeling away, but her stomach lurched again. Dropping the wooden spoon, she rushed outside into the biting cold, barely making it around the corner of the cabin before emptying her stomach into the snow. The cold air burned her lungs as she steadied herself against the rough logs of the cabin wall. She wiped her mouth with trembling fingers and took several deep breaths before returning inside. Boone glanced up from where he sat, cleaning his rifle at the table. His weathered face revealed nothing, but his eyes followed her as she returned to the stove, straightening her skirts and retrieving a fresh spoon. "Just a touch of morning sickness," Clara said lightly, stirring the porridge to check for scorching. "Must have been something I ate." The next morning brought the same result. Clara woke with the familiar churning in her belly, this time not even making it to the door before retching into the wash basin. Boone watched from across the room, his face etched with quiet concern. When she'd finished rinsing her mouth and settling back into a chair, Boone set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. His voice was gruff but gentle when he spoke. "You carrion?" The question hung in the air between them. Clara's hands twisted in her lap as she met his steady gaze. Slowly, she nodded. "It's Levi's," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "From before I knew what kind of man he was, what he planned." She drew a shaky breath. "When I fled, part of me hoped the cold would—" She couldn't finish the thought, her hand drifting unconsciously to her still flat belly. "But the mountain showed more mercy than I expected." Boone sat perfectly still, his face unreadable as stone. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the pop and hiss of burning wood in the hearth. Without a word, he rose from the table and pulled on his heavy coat. The door closed behind him with a quiet click that felt louder than a slam. Clara spent the morning trying to keep busy, though her hands shook as she went about her tasks. She swept the floor twice, reorganized the pantry shelves, and mended a tear in one of Boone's shirts, all while straining to hear any sound from outside. As afternoon faded toward evening, she noticed an unusual noise coming from the shed behind the cabin. The steady rhythm of sawing, followed by the sharp rap of hammer against nail, continued until well after dark. When Boone didn't come in for supper, Clara wrapped herself in her shawl and ventured out into the cold night air. The shed door stood slightly ajar, lamplight spilling out onto the snow. She approached quietly, not wanting to startle him. Boone knelt on the packed earth floor, surrounded by fresh wood shavings. His hands moved steadily over a piece of pine, smoothing rough edges with practiced strokes of his knife. In the lantern light, Clara could make out the gentle curve of what he was creating, the beginning of a cradle. Her sharp intake of breath made him look up. His eyes were soft in the golden light as he gestured for her to come closer. "Pine's good for cradles," he said, running his hand along the smooth wood. "Strong, but light. Won't splinter none once it's finished proper." He paused, testing the curve of one runner with his thumb. Figure we got some months yet to get it right? Clara's vision blurred with tears as she watched his careful movements. Each stroke of his knife spoke of acceptance, of protection, of a future she hadn't dared to imagine. She sank down beside him on an overturned crate, her shoulder brushing his, as they sat in companionable silence. The next morning, Boone brought the partially finished cradle into the cabin, setting it near his workbench by the window. Sunlight caught the fresh-cut pine, making it glow like honey. Clara ran her fingers over the smooth wood, marveling at how something so simple could carry such weight of meaning. "Reckon every child deserves a proper place to rest," Boone said quietly, standing beside her. "Don't matter none how they come into this world." He picked up his carving knife, testing its edge against his thumb. "Mountain chose to keep you both alive. Ain't our place to question that mercy." Clara watched as he began working again, each careful cut shaping the pine into something new, something meant for hope and future rather than past and pain. The steady rhythm of his knife against wood filled the cabin with its quiet promise. Clara sat cross-legged by the hearth, carefully piecing together squares of fabric. Boone had surprised her that morning with a bundle of cloth scraps, old shirts, worn blankets, and even a faded calico dress that had belonged to Ayanna. Each piece held its own history, and Clara's fingers moved reverently over the materials as she sorted them by color and size. "These'll make fine blankets for the little one," she said softly, holding up a particularly soft piece of blue wool. Boone nodded from his place at the table, watching as she matched edges and began to stitch. The quiet afternoon was interrupted by the crunch of boots on snow. Boone was at the window in an instant, rifle in hand, but relaxed slightly when he recognized Jake Wheeler, a trapper who occasionally traded along the mountain routes. "Brought news with my pelts," Jake said after stepping inside, stamping snow from his boots. His eyes flickered briefly to Clara before settling back on Boone. "Might want to hear this private-like." Boone shook his head. "Speak your piece." Jake pulled a crumpled paper from his coat pocket. "Town's plastered with these. Figured you ought to know, seeing as how you're up here alone and all." He handed the flyer to Boone, who unfolded it with careful fingers. Clara watched as Boone's face hardened while reading. His jaw clenched tight, and a muscle twitched in his cheek. Without a word, he crushed the paper in his fist. "How much they offering?" he asked, voice low and dangerous. $500 for her recovery," Jake replied. "Levi Tanton's men are posting them everywhere. Says she's deranged, escaped from proper medical care. Got some doctor's signature claiming she needs to be returned for her own safety." Clara's hands trembled in her lap, the half-finished blanket forgotten. "They're making me sound mad," she whispered. "Just like before." Jake shifted uncomfortably. "There's more. They're saying she stole property, some kind of deed. Tanton's offering extra for that to be returned undamaged." Boone moved to the fireplace and tossed the crumpled flyer into the flames. "Much obliged for the warning," he said to Jake. "Got some fresh venison to trade for your trouble." After Jake left with his payment, silence filled the cabin. Clara stared into the fire, watching the last edges of the poster curl and blacken. "They'll come looking," she said finally. "Up here, eventually. Maybe." She swallowed hard. "Maybe I should just go back, before anyone gets hurt." "No." Boone's voice cut through the air like steel. He turned to face her, his eyes intense. "No man owns you. Not in this cabin, not anywhere." He strode to the window, peering out at the snowy landscape. "Tanton thinks he can buy and sell people same as cattle. Thinks that paper makes you his property." He spat the word like it tasted bitter. "But you ain't property, Clara. You're a free woman with your own claim, your own blood right to that land." Clara watched as he began moving with purpose around the cabin, gathering tools and boards. "What are you doing?" "Securing what's ours," he replied, already measuring the windows. The sharp rap of his hammer filled the cabin as he began nailing boards across the lower panes, leaving just enough space near the top for light and watching. Clara set aside her sewing and rose to help, holding boards steady as he worked. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "This isn't your fight." Boone paused, turning to look at her. "Became my fight the moment you knocked on my door." He moved to the corner where his Spencer carbine leaned, checking its action and ammunition. "Besides, that spring on your land? It's sacred to my wife's people. Tanton wants it for his railroad. He'll have to face more than just us." As evening settled over the mountain, Boone finished securing the cabin. Clara returned to her sewing, but now her stitches formed a pattern of protection, each piece joined to another, creating something stronger than its parts. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering their tracks and wrapping the cabin in its quiet blanket of white. Boone sat cleaning his rifle by lamplight, his presence a steady comfort in the growing darkness. Clara touched her belly, feeling the first flutter of the life within. In this moment, surrounded by Boone's quiet strength and determination, she finally believed his words. She belonged to no man but herself. The January sun brought an unexpected warmth that sent rivulets of melting snow coursing down the mountainside. Boone stood at the cabin door, frowning at the dripping icicles and the sound of shifting snow in the distance. The thaw had come too fast, making the slopes treacherous. Clara joined him, her pregnancy now showing beneath her borrowed coat. "Something's wrong?" she asked, noting his concerned expression. "Avalanche weather," Boone said, testing the ground with his boot. "Need to show you the escape routes while we can. Might not get another chance before spring." They gathered supplies for an overnight trip: bedrolls, dried meat, and extra ammunition. Boone insisted Clara wear his spare boots, better suited for the muddy terrain than her worn shoes. As they set out, he kept a watchful eye on the snow-laden slopes above. "Stay close to the tree line," he instructed, leading her down a narrow path. "If you hear a rumble, run for the biggest trunk you can find." His voice carried the weight of experience, each word measured and vital. They traversed the mountainside slowly, Boone pointing out landmarks: a lightning-struck pine, a distinctive boulder, a bend in the creek that never fully froze. "Remember these," he said. "They'll guide you down if visibility's poor." By mid-afternoon, they reached a sheltered glen surrounded by rock walls. A small overhang provided natural protection, and old char marks showed where others had made camp before them. "We'll rest here," Boone decided, helping Clara settle on a dry patch of ground. He gathered wood for a fire while she laid out their bedrolls under the overhang. As darkness fell, they sat close to the flames, sharing coffee from Boone's battered tin pot. The stars emerged one by one, bright and clear in the winter sky. Clara wrapped her blanket tighter and watched Boone's face in the firelight, noting how the shadows deepened the lines around his eyes. "You've been teaching me all these escape routes," she said softly, "like you've spent years planning every possible way down this mountain." Boone stared into the fire, his hands clasped tight around his coffee cup. "Learned the hard way what happens when you don't know all the paths home." He fell silent for a long moment before continuing. "My boy, Thomas, he was 16 when the war came. Strong, smart as any man I knew, but I wasn't there when he needed me most." Clara set aside her cup, listening intently as Boone's story unfolded. "I was scouting for the army during the Bannock War," he continued, his voice rough with memory. "Thought I was doing right by him, keeping the peace. But while I was gone, raiders hit our homestead, Ayanna." His voice caught. "She died protecting our boy. Thomas ran into the mountains trying to reach the Nez Perce camp where her family lived. Nobody ever saw him after that." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Boone's shoulders were hunched, as if bearing a physical weight. "Left the army that same day. Spent 2 years searching every trail, every valley. Found signs sometimes. Old camps, tracks that might have been his, but the mountain kept its secrets. He drew a shuddering breath. Should have been there. Should have chosen my family over some damned war that wasn't even mine to fight. Clara moved closer, her hand finding his in the darkness. His fingers were cold despite the fire's warmth. You were trying to protect them, she said gently. Same as you're protecting me now. Difference is, I won't leave this time, Boone replied, his grip tightening on her hand. Won't make that mistake again. They sat in companionable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead. Clara thought about choices, the ones that haunted us, and the ones that offered redemption. She thought about the child growing within her, and this gruff, wounded man who had opened his home and his heart. Sometimes, she said carefully, the path home isn't the one we left on. Sometimes it's the one we find when we're lost. Boone looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing past the young woman he'd found at his door to something deeper. He nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. They stayed like that, hands clasped, until the fire burned low and the night air grew sharp with frost. Above them, the stars continued their ancient dance, witnesses to all the grief and grace that these mountains had seen. The trek back to the cabin took longer than usual. The melting snow had turned the path treacherous, forcing them to pick their way carefully between patches of ice and mud. By mid-morning, they finally crested the last ridge that led to home. Boone stopped so suddenly that Clara nearly walked into him. His arm shot out, holding her back. The cabin door stood open, swaying slightly in the mountain breeze. "Stay here," he ordered, drawing his Spencer carbine. Clara pressed herself against a pine trunk, heart hammering, as Boone moved forward with the silent grace of a mountain lion. He disappeared inside. Long moments passed before his voice called out, "Clear. But you best prepare yourself." Clara's legs felt wooden as she approached. The sight that greeted her made her gasp. The inside of the cabin, their sanctuary through the bitter winter months, had been torn apart. The curtains she'd sewn from flour sacks lay in shreds. Their supplies were scattered across the floor, containers broken open, food trampled into the dirt. Even the cedar cross had been ripped from above the hearth and snapped in two. But it was Boone's reaction to the cradle that broke her heart. He knelt beside the splintered pieces of pine, running weathered fingers over the careful carving he'd done. The cradle had been more than wood. It had been a promise, a declaration that this child would have a home. "Levi's men," Clara whispered, recognizing boot prints that matched those who'd worked his ranch. She picked up a torn wanted poster bearing her name, dropped carelessly near the door. Boone stood slowly, his jaw tight. "Help me salvage what we can," he said, voice rough. "Food first, then blankets." They worked in tense silence, gathering what remained usable. Clara found her mother's deed hidden in the false bottom of the trunk, where Boone had suggested she keep it. The paper was untouched, but the violation of their space hung heavy in the air. As evening approached, Boone reinforced the door and windows, though they both knew it was futile against determined men. The cabin that had felt so secure now seemed fragile as an eggshell. Clara watched him work, one hand resting on her growing belly. She'd been turning an idea over in her mind all afternoon, and now she couldn't stay silent any longer. "Your wife's cousin," she said carefully. "Nemi Tall Elk. You said he works at the reservation agency." Boone's shoulders stiffened. "No. But he could help us. The agency has legal authority." I said no. Boone turned to face her, his expression fierce. "That trail's too exposed. They'll be watching for us to run." "We can't stay here," Clara pressed. "They'll come back with more men next time. The agency could protect my claim to the land, protect the baby. I already lost one family." The words burst from him like shots from a gun. He stood there, breathing hard, fists clenched at his sides. When he spoke again, his voice was lower but no less intense. I won't lose another. Not you. Not that child." The declaration hung in the air between them. Clara felt tears prick her eyes at the word family, at all it meant coming from this solitary man who'd taken her in on a snowy night. "You won't lose us," she said softly. "But we need help, Boone. We can't fight Levi alone. Your wife's people. They have a claim to this land too. The sacred spring you showed me in the ledger? That's their history. Their rights being stolen just like mine." Boone turned away, staring out the window at the darkening sky. The tension in his back spoke of old grief, of memories of another family he couldn't protect. Clara stepped closer, laying a gentle hand on his arm. "Sometimes protecting family means knowing when to ask for help. You taught me that. Every day you've helped me since I arrived." The cabin creaked in the wind, reminding them of its vulnerability. Outside, somewhere in the gathering dusk, Levi's men were surely planning their return. Time was running out for safe choices. Boone covered her hand with his own, rough palm warm against her skin. He didn't speak, but Clara could feel him wrestling with the decision, with his fears of loss warring against the need to keep her and the baby safe. The broken cradle lay in the corner, a stark reminder of what they faced. Whatever choice they made, it would have to be soon. 2 days passed in tense vigilance. Every snapping twig, every shadow at dusk made them reach for weapons. Clara kept the deed close, tucked into her bodice, while Boone maintained a watchful eye on the trail leading to their door. The morning sun had just cleared the mountain peaks when they heard horses approaching. Clara was kneading bread dough, but her hands froze at the sound. Boone moved to the window, his expression hardening as he counted the riders. 3 men, he said quietly. Levi himself this time. Clara's fingers left deep impressions in the dough. What do we do? Stay back from the windows. Boone grabbed his Spencer carbine, slinging it across his shoulder with practiced ease. Let me handle this. Heavy boot steps crossed the packed earth outside. A sharp knock rattled the door. McAllister, Levi's voice carried the arrogant command of a man used to being obeyed. Open up, I know she's in there. Boone shot Clara a reassuring look before opening the door. He filled the frame completely, blocking any view of the cabin's interior. Clara pressed herself against the wall beside the door, heart pounding so hard she was sure they could hear it. State your business, Boone said, his voice level but carrying an edge of steel. Through the crack between door and frame, Clara could see Levi astride his horse, flanked by 2 rough-looking men with rifles balanced across their saddles. Levi's expensive coat and polished boots seemed out of place against the rugged mountain backdrop. My business is the theft of valuable property and the return of an unwell woman to proper care, Levi announced, loud enough for anyone inside to hear. Clara Whitley is not in her right mind. She stole documents from my office and fled her treatment. The doctor at the sanitarium confirms her derangement. That so? Boone's tone remained neutral, but his fingers tightened on the carbine's strap. She needs help, McAllister. Professional care. Hand her over, and I'll ensure she's treated with all due consideration. Levi's smile didn't reach his eyes. There's a reward, of course. Enough to set a man up comfortable. Clara's nails dug into her palms. The familiar mix of fear and fury rose in her throat at his words, at how easily he spoke of locking her away again. Ain't no Clara Whitley here, Boone said firmly. Don't play games with me, old man. We found her tracks leading to this cabin. We know she's... Said there's no Clara Whitley here. Boone cut him off. There's only my wife, Clara McAllister. The declaration hung in the crisp mountain air. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Even the horses seemed to sense the tension, shifting restlessly under their riders. Levi's face darkened. You're lying. There's been no wedding, no license filed. Tribal custom, Boone replied evenly. Same as with my first wife. Legal enough for these mountains. You can't, My wife's resting now, Boone continued, his voice growing harder. And you're trespassing on my property. With that, he stepped back and shut the door firmly in Levi's face. They heard cursing, followed by Levi's voice rising in anger. This isn't over, McAllister. I'm coming back with a marshal and proper papers. We'll see how legal your marriage is then. The sounds of horses being turned, angry mutters between the men, then hoofbeats retreating down the trail. Only when the last echoes faded did Boone move away from the door. Clara stood rooted to her spot, staring at him. The word wife seemed to hang in the air between them, heavy with meaning. You didn't have to do that, she whispered. Boone busied himself checking the door's reinforcements. Had to say something to make him back off. Man like that only respects claim marks, ownership. His voice turned bitter on the last word. Figured a husband's rights might carry more weight than a mountain man's hospitality. So you only said it to protect me? Clara's voice was soft, but something in her tone made Boone turn to face her. She stood straight despite her obvious tension, one hand resting on her swelling belly, the other still pressed against the wall. Her eyes met his directly, showing the same quiet strength that had brought her to his door that snowy night. Then maybe I'll say it for real next time, she said. Boone's weathered face showed a flash of surprise before he got it under control. He looked away, adjusting the carbine's strap with careful precision. The morning light streamed through the window, catching the dust motes stirred up by their confrontation. Outside, a mountain jay called, reminding them that the world continued turning despite the drama that had just unfolded. The abandoned bread dough sat on the table, Clara's fingerprints still pressed into its surface, waiting to be shaped into something new. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the cabin's rough-hewn walls. Clara sat mending one of Boone's shirts by candlelight, her stitches neat and precise despite the dim light. The confrontation with Levi earlier that day had left them both on edge, though neither spoke of it. Boone stood at his wooden chest, his movements slow and deliberate as he removed items one by one. The metallic clink of coins broke the evening silence. Clara looked up from her sewing to see him counting out money into a leather pouch, his face drawn in concentration. A sudden harsh cough racked his frame. He tried to muffle it with his sleeve, but Clara saw the dark stain that spread across the fabric. "Boone?" She set aside her mending and crossed to him. "You're ill." He waved off her concern, but another cough doubled him over. This time there was no hiding the blood that speckled his hand. "It's nothing," he managed, but his voice was rough. "Just an old wound acting up." Clara's hands trembled as she helped him to a chair. "How long has this been happening?" "Few weeks now." He pulled the pouch closer, adding Clara's deed to the coins. "Started up again when the cold set in. Musket ball caught me in the chest years back. Never did heal, right?" "We need to get you to a doctor," Clara insisted, but Boone shook his head. "No time for that now." He pulled a folded paper from his shirt and added it to the pouch. "This here's a letter. To my wife's cousin, Nemi Tall Elk, at the reservation agency. She'll help you file the deed proper, get it recorded legal-like before Levi can challenge it." Clara stared at the pouch, understanding slowly dawning. "Number, I'm not leaving you here." "You have to." His voice was firm despite its weakness. "Levi will be back with the law, maybe tomorrow. You heard him. Can't protect you if I can barely stand." "Then we'll both go," Clara pleaded. "We can make it to the reservation together." Boone's weathered face softened. One healthy rider on a good mule might slip past them. Two, with one of us sick? We'd never make it. He pressed the pouch into her hands. "This money's from my trap lines, enough to see you through till spring." Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks as she clutched the pouch. "You can't ask me to do this. Not after everything." "I'm not asking." He caught her gaze, his eyes bright with fever but determined. "I'm telling you, that baby you're carrying deserves a chance. The land deserves proper protection. Some things are worth dying for." Clara's shoulders shook with silent sobs as she began gathering provisions. She packed dried meat, hard biscuits, and an extra blanket into Boone's old saddlebags. Every movement felt like a betrayal, but she knew he was right. The child within her kicked, as if sensing her distress. The night passed too quickly. As the first gray light of dawn crept over the mountains, Clara stood at the cabin door. Boone had already saddled his best mule, the sure-footed animal that knew every trail on the mountain. "Take the eastern path," he instructed, his breath wheezing slightly. "Stay off the main trails. Nemi will know what to do once you show her that letter." Clara gripped his rough hand. "I'll come back for you. Once the deed is filed, once it's safe." "No." He squeezed her fingers once, before letting go. "You make your own way now. Build something good on that land." She mounted the mule, her heart breaking at how frail Boone looked standing in the doorway. The proud mountain man who had taken her in that snowy night now leaned heavily against the doorframe, but his eyes were clear and steady as they met hers. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Boone nodded once, then turned his face away. Clara nudged the mule forward, not looking back as she guided it down the eastern trail. The morning mist swallowed them quickly, hiding her tears from the man who had become more than just her protector. In the cabin doorway, Boone watched until they disappeared into the gray dawn light. His breath came in ragged gasps, but he remained standing, straight and tall, until the last echo of hoofbeats faded from the mountain air. The mountain trails were treacherous with spring thaw, forcing Clara to guide the mule carefully through patches of melting snow and mud. She wrapped Boone's old wool coat tighter around herself, grateful for its warmth against the damp air. The baby stirred within her as they picked their way down steep switchbacks, past towering pines heavy with moisture. For 2 days, she rode steadily eastward, stopping only when necessary to rest the mule or take small bites of the dried meat and biscuits Boone had packed. At night, she made camp in sheltered spots, keeping the fires small to avoid attention. The stars wheeled overhead, bright and cold, while coyotes called in the distance. On the morning of the 3rd day, wooden buildings appeared through the trees. The Flat Rock Agency. Clara's heart quickened as she guided the mule toward the collection of structures. A few people moved about the grounds, and heads turned to watch her approach. Her hands trembled slightly as she dismounted in front of the main office, her legs stiff from riding. A tall man with graying hair stepped out onto the porch, his dark eyes studying her carefully. Clara pulled Boone's letter from her pouch with shaking fingers. "I'm looking for Nemi Tall Elk," she said, her voice hoarse from disuse. The man nodded slowly. "I am he." He took the offered letter, his expression changing as he recognized the handwriting. "This is from Boone McAllister." "Yes, sir." Clara swayed slightly, exhaustion catching up with her. Nemi caught her arm, steadying her. "Come inside. You look ready to fall over?" The agency office was warm, with a pot-bellied stove in the corner and neat rows of filing cabinets along the walls. Nemi helped Clara to a chair, then read Boone's letter carefully. His face grew serious as he studied the deed she handed him next. "This land," he said quietly, "it holds sacred waters. My cousin Ayana, Boone's wife, she used to tend the spring there." He looked up at Clara. "The railroad has been trying to claim those water rights." Clara nodded wearily. "That's why Levi Tanton wanted to marry me, to take control of the deed." Nemi's expression hardened. "Wait here." He returned shortly with a pot of tea and a middle-aged woman wearing a clean apron. "This is Sarah Whitehorse, our midwife. She'll look after you while I send some telegrams." The midwife clucked her tongue at Clara's exhausted state, helping her drink the hot tea. Her gentle hands checked Clara's pulse and felt her swollen belly. "The baby is strong," she assured her. "But you need rest, young mother." Through the afternoon, Nemi worked steadily. He sent runners to fetch both the tribal legal representative and a telegram operator. Clara dozed in her chair, dimly aware of people coming and going, of quiet discussions and papers being shuffled. Late in the day, Nemi roused her. "United States Marshal Croft will be here by tomorrow," he said. "I've had a telegram sent to the Tanton Ranch, warning them to cease any claim on your land until the matter is legally settled." He paused, studying her face. "The deed is valid, Clara. With both federal and tribal recognition, Levi Tanton cannot touch it, or you." Relief flooded through her, but worry for Boone gnawed at her heart. "There's a chapel here?" Nemi nodded, helping her stand. "I'll show you." The small chapel was simple but peaceful, with wooden pews and windows that caught the setting sun. Clara sank to her knees, her prayers a whispered mixture of gratitude and desperate hope for Boone's survival. "Please," she murmured, one hand pressed to her belly, the other clutching the rough-hewn pew. "Please let him live. Let him see this child born. Let him know his sacrifice wasn't in vain." The chapel's silence held no answers, but as the last rays of sunlight painted the walls in gold, Clara felt a measure of peace settle over her. She had made it. The deed was safe. The law was on her side. Now she could only pray that Boone had the strength to hold on until she found a way to help him. Sarah Whitehorse appeared in the doorway. "Come, child. I've prepared a bed for you. Tomorrow will bring its own battles, but tonight you need to rest." Clara rose slowly, following the midwife out into the gathering dusk. Behind them, the chapel windows glowed softly, like beacons of hope in the darkness. Thin wisps of smoke rose from the canyon ahead, dark against the pale morning sky. Clara's heart clenched at the sight. She urged her mount forward, keeping pace with Marshal Croft and his deputies, while Nemi rode beside her on his sturdy paint horse. "There," she pointed, her voice tight with fear. Through the trees, they could see flames licking at one corner of Boone's cabin. The marshal raised his hand, signaling them to approach with caution. As they drew closer, they saw bodies sprawled in the mud. Two of Levi's hired guns, caught in Boone's defensive traps. Boot prints and bullet holes marked the cabin's weathered walls. "McAllister," Marshal Croft called out. "It's U.S. Marshal Croft. We're here with Clara Whitley." A weak voice responded from inside. "Doors unbarred." Clara leaped from her horse before it fully stopped, rushing to the cabin. Smoke stung her eyes as she pushed through the door. There, propped against the far wall with his rifle across his lap, sat Boone. Blood had soaked through his shirt, but his eyes were alert and fixed on her. "You came back," he whispered hoarsely. Clara fell to her knees beside him, tears streaming down her face. "Of course I came back, you stubborn old man." Her hands fluttered over his wounds, a bullet grazed on his arm, another in his side. The marshal and his deputies secured the area while Nemi helped Clara tend to Boone. Outside, they heard shouting and the sound of horses approaching. "That'll be the rest of them," Boone muttered. "Tanton led the attack himself. Dawn yesterday." Sure enough, Marshal Croft's voice rang out. "Levi Tanton! You're under arrest for trespass, forgery, and attempted fraud on native land. Drop your weapon." Through the open door, Clara watched as Levi slowly lowered his rifle, his face twisted with rage. The deputies moved in, binding his hands. "Get a stretcher rigged," Marshal Croft ordered. "McAllister needs medical attention." Nemi and the deputies fashioned a stretcher from blankets and pine poles. As they carefully lifted Boone onto it, his face went pale with pain. Clara gripped his hand, refusing to let go. "Stay with me, Boone," she pleaded. "Just stay with me." His eyes were growing heavy, exhaustion finally claiming him. "Ain't going nowhere," he mumbled. Clara leaned close, her tears falling on his weathered cheek. "I'm staying, Boone, and this time, I mean it." A faint smile touched his lips as he drifted into sleep, his hand still warm in hers as they carried him out of the smoke-filled cabin and into the clear mountain air. The mountain air carried the sweet scent of spring blossoms as hammers rang out across the clearing. Where Boone's old cabin had stood, a new home rose from fresh-cut timber. Nez Perce carpenters from the reservation worked alongside settlers from the valley, their shared labor bridging old divisions. Clara watched from beneath the cottonwood tree, one hand resting on her swollen belly. The new cabin was larger, with proper windows and a stone chimney. But more than that, it represented their future, one built on healing rather than hurt. Boone supervised the work, moving slower since his wounds but with purpose in every step. He'd insisted on adding a covered porch where, he said, a body could sit and watch the sunset. Clara knew he meant where they could sit together. When the last shingle was laid and the door hung true, they gathered under that same cottonwood tree. Spring winds rustled new leaves as Nemi stood before them, wearing his formal vest and speaking in both Nez Perce and English. Clara wore a simple calico dress she'd sewn herself, with wildflowers in her hair. Boone had traded for a new shirt, though he still wore his old boots. "They know the way home," he'd said with a wink. Their vows were simple, spoken from hearts that had already proven their truth through the winter's trials. When Nemi pronounced them husband and wife, Boone's weathered hand trembled slightly as he lifted Clara's face to his. Their kiss tasted of joy and promise. A month later, as dawn painted the mountains gold, Clara gave birth to their daughter. The midwife from the reservation helped, while Boone paced the porch, wearing a path in the new boards. When the baby's first cry split the air, he fell to his knees in prayer. "Sahale," Boone whispered when he first held her, tears tracking down his cheeks. "It means above the sky in her grandmother's tongue." Clara nodded, understanding this was his way of connecting their daughter to the family that came before. Now, in the gentle evening light, Boone rocks in his chair on that wished-for porch. The cradle beside him holds sleeping Sahal, her tiny fist curled around his finger. Clara's voice carries soft and clear as she reads from her mother's Bible, the same one that had traveled with her through snow and fear to find sanctuary at Boone's door. They've built more than a cabin here. They've built a home, not from obligation or desperation, but from the mercy shown on a winter night, from faith that guided them through darkness, and from love tested by fire and found unshakable. The sacred spring still flows on the eastern ridge, its waters now protected by law and tradition. But the truest sanctuary they've found is here, in the family they've forged together, in the peace of the evening, in the promise of tomorrow. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.